The creation of the United States Space Force may seem a little out there for some people. In fact, there's a popular Netflix comedy about the newest branch of the U.S. military. It's called Space Force, of course.
Our nation's internet runs through our vulnerable space satellites. POTUS wants complete space dominance. To that end, the president is creating a new branch, Space Force, which Mark will run.
What?
But the actual U.S. Space Force is taken very seriously. Members are called Guardians. Okay, well, that sci-fi reference is hard to avoid now. You know the one, Guardians of the Galaxy.
They call themselves the Guardians of the Galaxy.
Having very different, real guardians makes sense to Brad Jolliff, the director of the McDonnell Center for the Space Sciences at Washington University in St. Louis.
I think the Guardians is, that may be a very good slogan because Space Force will have as primary mission objective security of spaceborne assets. And so when I say that, you might think, well, anything in space, but let's think for a minute near Earth space and low Earth orbit. Lots of satellites.
Cyber attacks and jamming of our satellites. Microsatellites that can create a debris field. At 17,000 miles an hour, a piece of metal the size of a coin can be weaponized.
But then you could extend that to things like having an interest in the moon as high ground in the Earth-Moon system, or even beyond once we get to traveling, say, with astronauts to Mars and establishing bases on the moon and Mars, far distant kinds of things that Space Force would be interested in.
Jolliff has been a research scientist and Scott Rudolph Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Washington University for many years.
I'm involved in research that ranges from the moon, which is, I think, very relevant for Space Force, to the exploration of the planets, to formation of solar systems, and to astrophysics and cosmology and the origin of the universe.
And Jolliff was in the U.S. Army, so he says he understands the military and why having a Space Force is a step in the right direction.
But I'm very familiar with what Space Command was doing prior to the formation of Space Force, and I have an appreciation for what the U.S. Space Force is going to be doing. Artemis will put astronauts on the moon in the next few years, perhaps. That's the plan. It's going to happen. It's near term. And I think this is something that Space Force will be very interested in following. And there's yet another aspect that's coming, and that's commercialization of space and what will come with commercialization and interrelationship with Space Force and with science. It's going to be tens of billions of dollars put in, if not hundreds of millions of dollars put into these kinds of activities. And it's a good idea to be thinking about security and protection.
While earthly objects and people in space are a priority, there are some things out of this world that he expects will naturally be part of it all.
One of the big security concerns is what happens if there's a big solar flare that takes out electronics and a lot of the communications assets we have in orbit. And if something like that happens, what are the consequences? So there's a branch of NASA called heliophysics that studies the sun. And I would think that Space Force would be very interested in solar phenomena as they might occur to affect things like communications. And in fact, one of the missions of Space Force will be to have that kind of awareness of what's going on in the Earth environment, which includes the sun, obviously, and what the sun is doing, that may affect security assets.
Jolliff says a variety of research in his department aligns with U.S. Space Force interests.
It's not all about, boots in space, so to speak. It's going to be more about technology in space. We work with the same technology at the university in our laboratories as will be done with Space Force. Great synergy there. I think we'll work very well together, actually.
Future synergy can boost university admissions and career development, similar to the university's relationship with NGA, the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency, which has a strong presence in St. Louis.
The NGA is a great example. I had a PhD student who graduated a few years ago, and she now works for the NGA. There are a lot of synergies in what we do on the science side and what U.S. Space Force would do in terms of technology. There are technologies, let's just take an example, something called remote sensing, where we have sensors on a satellite gaining information. And that's a beautiful crossover between science and Space Force, because that's the kind of thing where somebody who's trained on the science side could get a job working for the Space Force. So I think there's great potential for growth of this kind of an interest at Washington University.